We live in a visual age, and we are used to seeing visual images. In fact, you've probably heard the phrase, "A picture's worth 1,000 words." When you're doing an oral presentation, your audience is likely to expect that you will use presentation aids. Today, we're going to talk about what Nick Burnett, my colleague over at Sac State, would call, "Where's the darn flip chart in this room?" or presentation aids. What are presentation aids, and why and when should you use aids? Presentation aids are anything that can aid an oral presentation. They can be visual, which is what you probably hear most of the time by professors when they tell you that you need to have visual aids. They can be audio or a combination of audio and visual aids. Remember that the purpose of presentation aids are to aid the audience in understanding and processing of the concepts that you are presenting. With that in mind, the aid should not be the presentation. I'm sure you've been in situations where presenters could have left the room and their whole presentation is word for word up on PowerPoint. You actually don't need the presenter. The aid should not distract from nor take over the presentation. And the aid should not be the reason for the presentation. You shouldn't select a topic because you found this really cool aid that would work. The bottom line is that the purpose of the presentation aid is to aid your presentation. I'm sure you're aware of several of the types of aids that are available. Let's talk about some of these in just a little bit more detail. The first are objects and models. Objects are real-life items. It could be recipes, or if you're doing a speech on yo-yos, you could bring a yo-yo in. Unfortunately, sometimes the objects are either not available or they don't work in this particular situation. If you were going to do a speech on the Starship Enterprise of Star Trek fame, for example, not only does it not exist, but even if it did exist, it's probably too large to bring into the facility, so you would need to use a model of that. Projection may include computer-assisted projection, such as what most people would call PowerPoint projection. This is commonly used in the business and in some academic environments. Overhead projectors are likely to be seen more frequently in the academic environment than in the business environment. These are a little difficult to use sometimes because you have to use special transparency film or it won't project onto the screen. In business, you may see more expensive document cameras. These are very similar to the overhead projectors, only they do not require specific transparency film. You could put a book on here and have the pages project as well. And of course, there's the old standby of slides. Now, slides have their advantages as well as their disadvantages. Obviously, they're awkward to carry around and they're expensive to make slides for a slide carousel. But if you're training somebody in, for example, how to judge an orchid competition, you would need the detail that you could get from a slide, which is significantly better than the detail that you would get from either a computer projection system or an overhead projector. All of these, however, have their drawbacks. Sometimes you have a facility that does not have the equipment that you need, and sometimes the way you've put your presentation together, you might require darkened rooms. There's also portable boards using easels to stand up. Sometimes you have table easels, and we talked earlier about flip charts. These are very low tech and they can work to your advantage. They can also work to your disadvantage because sometimes they're hard to carry around and awkward to use. Whiteboards and chalkboards are available. Whiteboards and chalkboards are good when you are thinking on the fly. But remember, in most speech situations, you should be prepared. A caveat about whiteboards: first of all, bring your own markers, and second of all, make sure that they are whiteboard markers, dry erase markers, and not wet markers, because you don't want to leave marks on a board, particularly if it's somebody else's, that's permanent. And then, of course, there's audio equipment. Again, you need to bring your equipment, including any cords that you might need or speakers that will help the audience hear what you want us to hear. And there's handouts. These are not recommended because when you use handouts, the audience is likely not listening to you. They're flipping through the handouts, and you can probably think about what it's like when you're in a classroom situation and the professor hands out things and everybody talks or looks at it, and you're no longer listening to what the professor has to say. So you lose control of the audience when you do handouts. But there are times that handouts might be appropriate. Why and when would you even want to use aids? One reason is that using aids can help in understanding. It improves audience understanding. You can clarify, making it clearer. It helps complex information be a little bit more understandable, or there's a point that you might need to see visualized. It adds interest, and it appeals to different learning styles. Many of us are visual learners, and when we see it, we're more likely to remember it. Presentation aids can also assist in audiences' abilities to retain and recall the information after the fact. A study conducted by the University of Pennsylvania found that if you only use your words, if we only hear what you say, then 70% of that information may be recalled 2 hours after the fact. But 3 days later, you can retain only 10% of that information. If what you do is show the information rather than talk about it, then your recall is at 72% 2 hours later. But 3 days later, the recall is twice what it was if all you did was talk about it. However, if you add in both the showing and the telling, the pictures and the auditory words, then you have significantly increased the retention not only 2 hours after the fact, but 3 days later. If you want your audience to recall the information, presentation aids might be the way to go. So they can help in understanding, in retention and recall, and they also can add variety and interest. Be careful that you're not using visual aids only to provide variety and interest. They should really aid in understanding. When used effectively, presentation aids can also save time. There was a study conducted by the University of Minnesota that determined that the average length of meetings in which visuals were used effectively were about 25% shorter than meetings where no visuals were used. That, of course, assumes that the visual aids are appropriate and effective. And finally, presenters that use visual aids effectively often end up being perceived as more credible than those who do not. They are perceived as being significantly more prepared, professional, persuasive, credible, and interesting. The University of Minnesota 3M study said that a typical presenter using presentation support has nothing to lose and can be as effective as a better presenter using no visuals. A key point here is a typical presenter, assuming that that presenter is at least competent. The better a presenter is, however, the more you need to use high-quality visual support, because it's expected that professionals are using effective presentation aids. Quiz time. What benefits are there to using presentation aids? What types of aids would be most appropriate for your next speaking opportunity? And what aids do you have access to? When it's time to put together an oral presentation, you should think not only about what you say, but what you might show while you say it.